Story 1. My name is Jake, and I have worked as a direct care aide for quite a while, helping individuals with developmental disabilities. This one job, though, was a first and a last for me. You will soon see why. The assignment was to care for a 65-year-old woman named Linda, who had dementia. Her daughter, Karen, was in her 40s and worked overnight shifts. Karen needed someone experienced to keep an eye on Linda, and I was hired for the task. At the time, I was already working with 2 other clients, so I figured I could handle it. Boy, was I wrong. Karen had told me she did not have much family around to help, and putting Linda in a nursing home was either out of the question financially or something she was not ready for. I understood and was determined to help. When I first met Linda, she smiled faintly before Karen took her upstairs to her bedroom for the night. Karen mentioned that Linda sometimes wandered the house, confused, and it would be my job to guide her back to her room. She made it clear that it was not sleepwalking but rather a symptom of her dementia. I assured Karen that I could handle it. That night started off quietly. I was sitting in the living room catching up on one of my favorite shows. Honestly, these jobs involve a lot of downtime, and this seemed no different. Around 9 p.m., I heard footsteps upstairs. I called out, "Linda, do you need anything?" There was no response, but I heard her footsteps retreat back to her room. Figuring she might have gone to the bathroom, I did not think much of it and returned to the couch. About an hour later, I went to the kitchen to grab the sandwich I had brought with me. As I turned to leave with the plate, my heart nearly leaped out of my chest. Linda was standing in the doorway, completely silent. Startled, I dropped the plate, shattering it on the floor. "Linda, are you okay?" I asked, trying to compose myself. She stared at me for a moment before shouting, "Who are you? Why are you here?" Her tone was sharp and accusatory. I explained who I was, reminding her that Karen had hired me. After a few tense moments, she calmed down enough for me to guide her back upstairs to her room. I gave her a glass of water and a melatonin tablet, hoping it would help her sleep through the night. By then, I was exhausted. I had been working another job earlier that day and was running on fumes. Karen had told me I could use the spare bedroom if I needed rest, and I decided to lie down for a bit. I set an alarm for an hour and fell asleep almost immediately. I woke up to a loud, rhythmic banging sound coming from downstairs. My heart raced as I tried to figure out what it was. I quickly made my way to the kitchen and found Linda standing in the dark, repeatedly opening and slamming the oven door. The sight was eerie, just her silhouette against the faint light of the oven. "Linda," I called out firmly. She stopped, turned towards me, and began walking up the stairs without saying a word. I followed her back to her room, where she slammed the door shut. When I peeked in a moment later, she was standing by the wall, facing it silently. It was unsettling, to say the least, but I managed to guide her back to bed. Thinking she was finally settled, I went back to the spare room. I tried to stay awake, but soon drifted off again. What woke me the second time was even worse. The room was pitch black, and I heard a noise coming from the closet. My eyes darted to the partially open door, where I saw the shadow of a head peeking out. My stomach dropped. "Linda?" I called out, my voice shaky. She did not respond but slowly pushed the door open and stepped into the room. As she got closer, I realized she was holding a large kitchen knife. I panicked. "Linda, put the knife down," I yelled. My voice seemed to startle her, and she began screaming back, repeating, "Who are you? I do not know you." She advanced toward me, and I knew I had to get out of there. I leaped off the bed and ran past her, dodging a slow swing of the knife. I bolted downstairs, grabbed my shoes, and went outside. My hands were shaking as I called Karen instead of the police, as she had specifically instructed. Karen was furious when I told her what happened, demanding that I stay until she got home. I stayed outside, keeping an eye on the house to ensure Linda did not leave. When Karen arrived, she was skeptical of my account until she found the knife near Linda's bed. She accused me of exaggerating, but I decided not to mention that I had fallen asleep. There was no point in fueling her blame. That was the last time I worked in Karen and Linda's house. After 9 years in this field, I had never encountered anything like that night. Linda was not just a patient. She was a danger, and I was not willing to risk my life again. Story 2. My name is Joe, And this story takes place on my very first day working for a plumbing company. It was not exactly the kind of start I had imagined. The company had 5 employees, and the owner was the one who decided who handled which job. For my first assignment, I was sent to a house way out of town in a really rundown area. Looking back, it is hard not to think that I was intentionally given an undesirable job for my first day. The call was for a leaky pipe under the sink. Typically, that is one of the easiest, most straightforward jobs a plumber can get, depending on what caused the leak. I pulled up to the house, my first ever job site, and it looked like something straight out of a horror movie. The place was filthy and falling apart, as if no one had lived there for years. I knocked on the door, and after a moment, a middle-aged man opened it. Right away, I felt uneasy. He had this overly wide, unsettling smile that made his entire face look odd. His voice was soft and high-pitched, completely mismatched with what I had expected from his appearance. Though, honestly, everything about him seemed off. He welcomed me in, and as I stepped inside, I noticed that the house was completely empty. There was not a single piece of furniture. "Just moved in?" I asked. He responded with a simple yes, followed by a strange giggle. Not a laugh, but a high-pitched little sound that made my skin crawl. He led me to the kitchen, and I set my tools down on the counter before getting to work. I opened the cabinet under the sink and slid underneath to check the pipe. I started examining the P-trap and the lock nuts to see if they were too tight or too loose. While I was working, I realized the man was standing directly over me, his legs on either side of me so that I was sandwiched between his feet. It was incredibly uncomfortable. I asked him politely to give me some space, and he stepped back a bit, but not enough to make me feel at ease. As I kept looking, I noticed something strange. There was no water leaking at all. I crawled out from under the sink and decided to test the faucet, but when I turned the handle, no water came out. Confused, I looked at the man and asked why the water was not running. He gave me an odd answer, saying he must have accidentally shut off the main water valve. I stood there for a moment, completely baffled. How do you do something like that by mistake? I asked him. He just smiled and shrugged his shoulders. I told him he needed to turn the water back on. He nodded and said he would be right back, then walked out of the kitchen. But instead of hearing him head to the basement or a utility closet, where the water valve is in every house I have ever worked in, I heard his footsteps going upstairs. That was my first big red flag. I had never heard of a water valve being upstairs. Something about this whole situation felt wrong. Then I heard multiple sets of footsteps coming down the stairs, fast. In that instant, my instincts kicked in. I grabbed my tools and made my way to the front door as quickly as I could without breaking into a run. I am not the kind of guy who gets scared easily. I am big, loud, and not easily intimidated. But something about this place, and that man told me I needed to leave immediately. I got to my van, threw my tools inside, and drove off without looking back. Once I was safely away, I called Dave, my boss. I told him it was just some sort of prank, which sounded better than admitting I was scared out of my wits. After calming down, I did a little digging. I found out that the house was actually abandoned and had been vacant for years. The number that had called in the job? It was a voice-over IP number, not even a real phone line. I decided to report the whole encounter to the local police. I wanted them to know about the shady situation and, hopefully, secure the house so no one else would have to deal with whatever was going on there. I never had a reason to go back to that sketchy part of town, and I only ended up working for that plumbing company for about a year. But that first day? That is a story I will never forget. Story 3. Back in 2019, I was working my first shift at a Domino's Pizza. I had picked up the job to save up some money for college expenses like supplies and dorm essentials. That night, I was being trained, which meant I was paired with the manager for my initial deliveries. The manager's job was to observe, guide me through the process, and evaluate my performance. There was another new hire being trained that night as well, a guy I had not met before. It was around 8 o'clock in the evening when we got a call for a delivery. The order was simple, 4 large pizzas and 2 bottles of soda. Our Domino's store did not have a fancy electronic system like many do now, where you can see everything on a screen. We had to pull up the address on our phones to figure out where we were going. The house was located way out in the middle of nowhere. My town was old, so it was not entirely unusual to find long stretches of land without much on them, but this felt different. The drive took us about 15 or 20 minutes. When we finally arrived, the house looked like it had been abandoned for decades. It was an old two-story wooden structure, with peeling paint and boarded-up windows. It was the kind of place you see in horror movies, and not the sort of house you'd expect someone to live in. I asked the manager if we really had to go up there, and he reassured me that we did. He said he would come with us to hand off the pizzas and the soda. Reluctantly, the other trainee and I got out of the car and followed him. As we approached the house, the other guy suddenly said he thought he saw someone watching us from one of the upstairs windows, the farthest one from the door. Our manager brushed it off, saying he was just being paranoid. He reminded us to stay calm, be polite, and get the job done quickly. I do not know where I found the courage, but I was the one who rang the doorbell. Of course, it did not work, so the manager pounded on the door. We waited for about 15 seconds, but there was no response. He knocked again, harder this time. Still, no answer. The three of us stood there, growing increasingly uncomfortable. The smell coming from the house was awful, like something had rotted. We could not tell if it was the house itself or something inside. Finally, after what felt like forever, the door creaked open. A man in his 50s poked his head out. He had an unsettling, overly friendly demeanor that immediately put me on edge. He apologized for taking so long to answer and explained that he had trouble moving around. His excuse did not quite add up, but we handed him the receipt and asked whether he'd be paying with cash or a check. He told us to wait while he went to get the money, leaving the front door wide open. I glanced inside, curious about what the house looked like. It was completely empty. No furniture, no decorations, nothing. Just bare floors and a couple of tattered blankets. It was obvious this man was squatting there. That was when we heard footsteps coming from upstairs. More than one set of footsteps. The other trainee's earlier observation now felt disturbingly real. Someone had been watching us. Our manager called out to the man, asking if he had the money yet, but there was no response. The footsteps stopped, and everything went eerily silent. The manager told us to stay at the front door while he went around the house to see if the man needed help. We reluctantly agreed and watched him disappear around the corner. As we stood there, we heard something even stranger, footsteps from below. The sound was faint but unmistakable. They were coming from beneath the house. The two of us exchanged nervous glances, both of us clearly freaked out. That was when we heard our manager scream. A moment later, he came sprinting back around the house, yelling at us to get in the car. I did not ask questions. We bolted to the car, and I drove off as fast as I could. Once we were a safe distance away, the manager explained what had happened. He said that when he went around the house, he saw a group of men huddled around a small campfire in the backyard. In the middle of their circle was a baby deer. The men were laughing and acting like it was some kind of sick joke. Hearing that sent chills down my spine. The other trainee and I quit the job immediately after that night. I heard through the grapevine that the manager stuck it out for another month before leaving as well. To this day, I have no idea what we stumbled upon, but I am just grateful we got out of there when we did. That was my first and last experience as a delivery driver, and I am never going back to anything like that again.